You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the upcoming French presidential elections. In a peculiar twist of personality politics, French voters will go to the polls on Sunday, choosing between bling bling and flamby. Of course, there are other candidates, but polling suggests it is a straight fight between Nicolas Sarkozy, known for his extravagant lifestyle, and François Hollande, whose nickname derives from a wobbly caramel pudding. While the frontrunners may fare equally well in this weekend's vote, Monsieur Sarkozy is tipped to lose heavily in the second round runoff on May the 6th. In fact, his approval rating of just 33% is coupled with the worst poll scores of any modern French president seeking re-election. So, why does the incumbent provoke such powerful feelings of Sarkophobia? What would a Hollande win and his top-rate 75% tax band mean for France? And could the far-right Marine Le Pen repeat an upset reminiscent of her father's second-round placement in 2002? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Adrian Pabst from the University of Kent, Zoé Tabary, a journalist at Le Petit Journal, Jean-Michel Duffrène, a presenter for French Radio London, and over the line with John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single-sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Maybe to you first, Adrian. Does Sarkozy even have an outside chance of keeping his job?
Well, a week is a long time in politics, so yes, he does have an outside chance if the dynamic after the first round can be sort of tilted in his direction.
Jean-Michel?
Well, you want a very short answer, so I would be inclined to say no because of all the, let's say, mistakes accumulated during the 5 years of his term and some symbolic mistakes as well. So I think that no, I think it's a lost cause for him.
A lost cause. Zoe?
I'd say that he has, although unlikely, a slight chance of winning three things: if he comes out first in the first round, if abstentionism is high, and if he performs extremely well at the debate between the two rounds.
Okay, and finally over to you, John Laughland.
Yeah, I think I concur with that. I mean, of course he has an outside chance, but I think it's the most likely outcome is that he will be a second Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, in other words, the only other president in the Fifth Republic who served only one term.
Okay, well, possibly slightly more positive on the Sarkozy front than we were looking at a few weeks ago. Maybe I'll turn to you, Jean-Michel. You were talking about the mistakes that he's made over the past 5 years, the reasons for his unpopularity. Maybe we can start there.
First of all, his slogan for the election in 2007 remained extremely famous, which was work more to earn more. And today, the Daily Libération actually made fun of that. And on the front page, you've got the old slogan. And if you turn the page around, you've got the reality 5 years later, which is work less because of unemployment and earn less. And I think that people will remember that slogan, you know, work more and earn more. And there was also those symbolic mistakes like starting by a party immediately after his election at Le Fouquet's on the Champs-Élysées. That was a big mistake, I think. And there was also the terrible mistake of trying to appoint one of his sons at La Défense. And I think that these mistakes will be remembered.
Maybe turning to you, Adrian, on the first point that he raises, that Sarkozy has ultimately failed to deliver.
Absolutely. He's not really fulfilled any of his main campaign promises from 2007. And I think it has to be said that he ran a very effective campaign then. Somehow, even though he'd been part of Chirac's governments and he'd been part of the ruling UMP party for so long, he managed to portray himself as le candidat de la rupture, which is quite an achievement. A bit like Chirac was talking about la fracture sociale back in 95. And so he managed to capture the imagination and came in with a strong mandate of 53%. And a strong parliamentary majority as well. But somehow he was totally unable to translate that into anything coherent that would make a difference to ordinary French people, the very people that he managed to mobilize in 2007. I think partly it's because of flip-flopping on fiscal policy, partly it's because he didn't know quite how to react to the crisis domestically. He may have been quite effective at the European level, working with Chancellor Merkel, but domestically he wasn't able to give France a sense of what it had to do to get out. It was sometimes austerity, sometimes it was tax cuts, but it didn't really add up. And I think the most crucial thing is that he lacks any strong ideology that one could see as a coherent whole. I suppose the Americans would say he looks like someone who flip-flops. And I think that's something that doesn't appeal to La France profonde.
Zoe, a flip-flopper, and he hasn't made a difference to the lives of ordinary French people. Do you agree?
I think it'd be fair to say that we say in French that the French vote with their feet. And I think that in this case, he starts with a huge disadvantage, that is, that he's the incumbent candidate. I think you have to hand him the few achievements that he's had. He was the first French president to tackle the retirement age, which is something I think needed to be done in Europe. He did have some significant achievements on the international scene, but I think that, as Jean-Michel has said, he's made some huge mistakes symbolically, and also I think that the difference with François Hollande is that he doesn't appear as the candidate of the people, he appears as the candidate of the rich, and whether that's true or not, that's the image that he sends back to France, and I think that now the French just want someone who understands them, who looks like them, who understands their problems. So I think that for those reasons, he has failed.
And over to you, John, in Paris. Is Sarkozy really the candidate of the rich?
Yes, he is. I mean, to take a slightly longer view, let's go back to 2002 when, as everyone remembers, Jean-Marie Le Pen beat the socialist candidate and Jacques Chirac ended up winning in the second round with 80% of the vote. In contrast to that election, Nicolas Sarkozy in 2007 famously drove the National Front vote down to something like 10%. I think Le Pen got 10% in 2007. And he did that by presenting himself as being very tough on the kinds of issues which appeal to Front National voters, particularly law and order and immigration. And I think that's where the greatest treachery has been on Sarkozy's part. He precisely was elected, at least in part, by people who had those kinds of concerns. In other words, by a part of the electorate which potentially could have voted for Le Pen. And it's precisely those people that he has betrayed. He has instead precisely appeared as the candidate of big business and of bling and all the rest of it. And we see that, of course, reflected in the very high score which Marine Le Pen seems to be poised to take. The polls are giving her 16%. Some of them have given her much more than that. If she wins that, she will do at least as well, if not much better, than her father did when he achieved his extraordinary result in 2002. And that really, I think, is the most serious indictment of Sarkozy's presidency, the fact that the Front National again represents a very large part of the right-wing electorate in France.
Jean-Michel, when you first spoke, you raised the issue of bling-bling, which I mentioned in my opening comments. Sarkozy has been seen cavorting with millionaires, putting his private life on display. There was the divorce and the relationship with Carla Bruni. And you raised his 2007 election victory when he goes to the Champs-Élysées, to that fancy restaurant, as being this big sort of public display of bling that was considered unsavoury by the French electorate. But is that really different to all these other champagne, caviar socialists that you get in Paris?
Yes, it's very different because we're talking about the head of state. And I think that something which didn't work with Mr. Sarkozy's image is that he tried to change the image of the head of state too much. And I think that it was too quick, maybe. He tried maybe to modernize that image, but I think that the French voters on the whole, you know, people say that we haven't got kings and queens anymore. So whoever is at the head of the state is supposed to represent the state with a certain sense of the state, and they have to appear to be above everything else. And I think that Mr. Sarkozy, by, as some people said, you know, by opening the room of his bedroom to the press and to the media, actually did make a mistake as well, because I think that people want a president which looks like a president.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the upcoming French presidential election. I'm joined by Adrian Pabst from the University of Kent, Zoé Tabary, a journalist at Le Petit Journal, Jean-Michel Duffrène, a presenter for French Radio London, and John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris. Now, we've been talking about Sarkozy himself and expressing ways in which he is unpopular, but I think maybe we haven't exactly tackled how deeply disliked he is in some quarters in France. One of my friends describes him to me as Sarko-Nazi. He's disliked by the intelligentsia. There's this term Sarkophobia. He's viewed as vulgar, money-obsessed, semi-racist and dangerous. I've even spoken to French diplomat friends of mine who are literally ashamed and horrified that he is the person that represents them. Maybe turning to you, Zoe, how deeply felt is this Sarkophobia?
I think, as you said, it really depends on which part of the population you're talking to. I think that a lot of people who François Hollande appeals to is maybe more the gauche caviar, which you mentioned, but also just your everyday French person who just wants a president who actually talks and feels like themselves. But I think that what's really interesting is that actually when you look in polls at which attributes the French see in both candidates, it's interesting to see that Nicolas Sarkozy scores pretty highly on leadership attributes, but that in terms of empathy in candidates who understands them and who they trust, they actually go for François Hollande. So I think it's interesting to see that even though they do recognize Sarkozy some attributes of presidents, it's pretty incredible to see that his mistakes have actually cost him the trust of so many French people. And I think that one last thing that has majorly changed is this trust that a lot of youth put in Sarkozy. In 2007, you had a very high percentage of youth who voted for Sarkozy, and I think that that's majorly changed. Students, first of all, but also you have an increasing number of international students with all the Erasmus programs, and you've had a number of stories of students who have had to go home because their visa wasn't being renewed, stories like that. So I think that he's performed pretty poorly among the youth.
When you're talking about Sarkozy and scoring quite highly on leadership, I think it's because he's the incumbent president. And in France, there is that tradition of the primo sortant, which is like a bonus to the incumbent president. And he's been working on that image as well. You know, it's one of his benefits for having been at the Élysée Palace for 5 years. I think this is the main reason why he's scoring higher on leadership than the other candidates.
One thing that he has done well, actually, is this solemn or serious attitude in, I'll take, for example, the Toulouse killings. I think that just for a while it was very temporary, but for 1 or 2 weeks he regained a short advance in the polls because I think the French people appreciate the way he conducted himself, but that didn't last long.
At that time he was coming across as presidential.
I think so, yeah. Presidential, dignified, as a head of state.
I suppose in some ways one could say that people associate power with Sarkozy and principle with Hollande, and that may not necessarily be accurate, but at the moment it's the image that Sarkozy would do whatever he can to stay in power, and the power he represents is the power of big government and big business, not the power of your ordinary French person, a household in the province, struggling to make ends meet. Hollande represents that kind of France. He's not really seen so much as the gauche caviar, even though he's been part of it for, 30 years of his life, because somehow he's maintained a strong embedding or strong local roots in Corrèze, of course, the homeland of Jacques Chirac, and it's now no secret that Jacques Chirac and probably most of his family and close friends will vote for Hollande.
And turning to you, John Laughland in Paris, maybe you can move us a little bit onto François Hollande, the Socialist Party candidate who is tipped to win in the second round, whose slogan, I'm trying to work out where he may have borrowed this from, is "Change is now." What do you think he represents?
Very little. I think he's an incredibly insipid character. What I wanted to comment on was really the campaign as a whole, and after all, there are 10 candidates in this race, not 2. What has struck me is the fact that I think, I can say without exception, not a single one of the candidates presents himself as a liberal. We've seen in this campaign how profoundly strong anti-liberalism and anti-liberal sentiment remains in France, and how strong as well, I think, is and I'd be interested to know what our French speakers think about this analysis, how strong as well is the sense of anxiety which French voters seem to feel. A lot of candidates, including Sarkozy, appeal to the perceived need by French voters to feel protected. There's 1 or 2 candidates have used l'Europe qui protège, Europe which protects as a slogan. But whether you're looking at the extreme left candidates, there are several of them, there are 2 or 3 of them, including Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has fought a very good campaign, or indeed the extreme right candidate, Marine Le Pen, not to mention Jacques Cheminade, the rather odd fellow who pops up and has been popping up at presidential elections now for several decades. What all these people have in common, as I say, is a very strong dislike of what are perceived as the excesses, probably rightly in my view, of the world capitalist system. Cheminade, for instance, had on his slogan, "A world without the city and Wall Street." And in all their different ways, each of the candidates panders to this view. And that, I think, is why, ultimately, it seems incredible, because France, certainly, in my view, doesn't need a socialist government at this stage. But that is why, ultimately, France is now going to turn left, because there seems to me to be an extraordinary consensus in France that the state needs to protect people and that the wilder excesses of liberalism need to be tamed.
Okay, maybe I'll throw that analyst over to you in the room. Maybe you first. Jean-Michel, French voters are feeling a sense of anxiety. They need to feel protected from a corrupt global economic system.
I completely agree with that analysis from Paris. And it's true that the traditions in France are rather different from the UK, for instance. I think that in France, the notion of public service is really there, and it's very difficult to change that, to reform that. And we saw what happened when the retirement age was changed to 62. There were demonstrations all over the place, and here in the UK people found it quite extraordinary that there was such an outcry for just 2 years, which is nothing, when here we're talking about, retirement age at 67. And it's true also to say that French people possibly were scared by the very word globalization. And I think that, there are a few phenomena which are more impressive than some others, like all the relocations, for instance. This is something which is being debated quite a lot. And a lot of the candidates actually are talking about a relocation, but the other way around. They want, things to be produced and manufactured in France, because they realize that, yes, because of the extreme choices of the liberal economic attitudes, the results produced by that attitude were not particularly in their favor. Yes, I agree also that Mr. Hollande is rather insipid, but I think this is one of his advantages, because he appears to be labeled as Monsieur Normal, Mr. Normal, as opposed to Mr. Bling Bling. And I think this is what people quite like after a president who hasn't been dignified all the way through.
Maybe putting that one over to you, Adrian. If France is moving away from this liberal capitalist model, isn't that going to be problematic for the country? And is this maybe something that isn't really being properly addressed by the candidates? France is, of course, facing a public finance squeeze. They're offering a kind of Swedish level of social services to their population, whilst at the same time having public finances that are not really like Germany's or Sweden's, but maybe more like Spain's. They've got a huge public spending deficit. And is this something that the candidates feel haven't got to grips with?
I don't think anyone has. I think the right just offers essentially more neoliberal policies, just austerity with tax cuts for the rich, hoping that private sector employment will somehow secure the recovery, which hasn't worked anywhere really. And I think the left at the moment, whether the more moderate left of Hollande or the more radical left of Mélenchon and others, is essentially statist and just wants to increase taxation and to, if anything, increase spending in order to create employment and protection. I don't think either will work, and I think Hollande has got a unique opportunity. If he comes in with a strong mandate, as he might well do after the second round and perhaps also in parliamentary elections, then he's basically got a choice. Will he do what Mitterrand did in 81 and stick to a kind of classical big status policy for 2 years and then have a spectacular U-turn? Or will he start differently and begin to decentralize the state and to try and build up an economy that remains rooted in France but is also open to competition, a bit like the German and Italian small and medium-sized businesses that are doing so well, that are really providing long-term employment and prosperity for those parts of Europe, I mean northern Italy in particular and the south of Germany. And I think he has been talking about decentralization, he's been talking about a more mixed, diversified economy. If he can help bring that about, he might stand a chance, but he'll have to act very quickly. And all the promises about spending, all the promise about tax hikes, I don't think will really work at all.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the French presidential election. I'm joined by Adrian Pabst from the University of Kent, Zoé Tabary, a journalist at Le Petit Journal, Jean-Michel Duffrène, a presenter for French Radio London, and over the line from Paris by John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. Turning to you, Zoé, when I asked John about what he thought about Hollande, he described him as an insipid character that he thought very little of. But this guy is most likely, odds on, going to be the next president of France. And we're talking about his economic policies. One of them is this 75% top-rate tax band. Is this what France really needs right now?
Well, first of all, to react to what you said, I think that, yes, Hollande's main quality is that he's insipid, but primarily that he's not Sarkozy. That's why people like him, because he's the anti-Sarkozy. And in terms of his 75% tax proposition. I think that that's mainly what scares businesses and countries abroad. So I think that in the UK especially, you've had a lot of headlines about François Hollande saying that, well, he said once that he doesn't like rich people. He said that he wants to revisit finance. And I think it was interesting to see that when he did come to London, he was kind of trying to tone it down a bit, which caused, I think, some people to say that in London he behaves as Thatcher, but in Paris he behaves as Mitterrand. And I think that we shouldn't focus too much on that 75% proposal, first of all, because it will only concern a very small percentage of the population. I think that he has done it kind of more as a political maneuver to regain some more leftist voters, but I think that it's not something that will be representative, or that's a key part of his campaign. I just think that it's been kind of overrepresented in the press because of the impact that it's had abroad. And also, I think especially because of kind of the balance of powers we have in the EU right now. So with Sarkozy, but also Merkel in Germany, Monti in Italy, and Mariano Rajoy in Spain, you very much have a conservative balance of power right now. So I think that that's what's mostly surprised voters.
Turning to you in Paris, John Laughland, just coming back on your comment about Hollande as an insipid character that you don't think very much of. I guess you're feeling fairly pessimistic about the next 5 years in France then?
Yes, I mean, I think you asked me about the slogan, Le changement c'est maintenant, change is now. I think really his slogan should have been plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, because it's impossible to imagine France changing substantially under an Hollande presidency. But I think one reason why I'm, apart from his own personality, why I'm pessimistic, is that I don't think it's at all certain that he will have a parliamentary majority. Adrian just referred to the matter just now briefly in passing. What we see in this election, and I come back to the point about the fact that there aren't just two candidates, we see, as ever, or at least as has been the case on other occasions in the past in France, we see the extremes pulling away from the centre. After all, we've got two candidates whose support in the first round is going to be in the low 20s, and we've got two candidates who are going to be between, say, something like 15 and 20%. I'm talking about Jean-Luc Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen. Now, it's not possible to say, I think, today what effect the scores that they have on Sunday will have on the composition, for instance, of the UMP party following a Sarkozy defeat, if that's indeed what happens, or, frankly, on the Socialist Party, because the actual support, support in the first round for these candidates is low. And what I'm saying is that we cannot, for instance, rule out a breakup of the UMP or a radicalization of its policies in order to cater for the voters who otherwise go to the Front National, and equally on the left. So I think the situation is very different from 1981, when François Mitterrand, of course, won the election, and there was an extraordinary sense of euphoria at that point, and indeed of a desire for change, because the right had been in power in the Fifth Republic since 1958. So this was a great watershed. It's not at all true now. I don't think that Hollande is being brought to power on a great upsurge of desire for change. And therefore it's quite possible to imagine that he would have a hostile majority in the parliament, and therefore his presidential manifesto would simply go up in smoke.
Jean-Michel, turning to you, moving on to some of the other candidates that John Laughland mentions, Marine Le Pen, the National Front candidate, her slogan is the voice of the people, the spirit of France. I mean, if you look at the economic situation in France at the moment, high unemployment, these are the kind of economic conditions under which people often move towards the right. Is that a concern for you? And is there any chance of a kind of a repeat of the 2002 election when Le Pen's father made it into the second round, which was quite a shock for people across Europe?
I do not think that in 2012 that risk actually exists, but the question of the political strength of the National Front is a bizarre thing, because people really are hooked on the scores. And we've seen actually that the scores of the National Front has been moving up and down like a yo-yo, and actually that depends on what President Sarkozy was saying about their main political themes. The more he was trying to attract National Front voters, the less voters would go to the National Front. But there was that famous phrase as well used by the leader of the National Front, which says that actually people who vote for the National Front realize that they prefer the original to the copy. And this is something which is quite worrying, because I think just looking at the numbers, and that's the National Front score 15% or 10%, I mean, is not really the point. The point is that those ideas exist, and I think this is more dangerous, and this is what needs to be tackled more than the actual score of the party itself.
Adrian, do you think we could be in for any surprises?
I think in the first round, no, not really. I think we know who's going to be in the second round. Of course, there could still be a very, very late upsurge in support for Sarkozy. Maybe abstention will hurt Hollande. But I don't think this will matter hugely. I think it is true that the parliamentary election will be the much more interesting one, and I largely agree with what John has said. I suppose, though, that smaller parties are still at a huge disadvantage in the French system. I mean, they very rarely have large parliamentary groups, and I don't think it's going to happen this time. In the FN, as we know, struggled to get into parliament since reforms in the 80s. However, I think what is the case, because the main candidates, Sarkozy and Hollande, have fought such a tactical campaign, not really about big themes, not about big ideas, but essentially about positioning, I think that will hurt them when it comes to the parliamentary vote, because the extremes will indeed affect the debate, and both candidates, or the head of the lists in the parliamentary elections will have to pander to those extremes. They will indeed affect the government. I still suspect the left will come out with a small majority, but of course it could be very unstable, and Hollande will indeed be in for a difficult 5 years trying to translate his ideas into any coherent government policies.
John Laughland, I hear you agreeing with that. We're running out of time, but is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, in a sense, I feel that I feel rather depressed, really, watching this process, although my depression is not limited to France. I think all European states are trapped in a situation now where really there's no choice, because the candidates, or at least the main ones, all agree on all the main issues. I mean, there are, slight differences at the edges, but they are, in the case of between Hollande and Sarkozy, they are really on very symbolic things like gay marriage and stuff like that. And I think that's a sad comment, not only on French political system, but really, I think, on all European states where the actual alternatives offered to voters are pretty minimal.
Zoe, are you as depressed as John?
I'd say I'm frustrated, because as a French citizen, I'm rather frustrated that by the debates of this election, that it feels that the whole debate has been shifted to more populist issues, so around immigration, security, raising or decreasing taxes, which I think do matter. But I do hope that between the two rounds, the debate shifts more to key issues, and I think that that's really what's been said abroad, that France is sort of in denial and not addressing the key issues which it needs to address. So I'm hoping for that. And I think it'll also be interesting to see between the two rounds how the other candidates who don't go through will react. And I think that a very typical future of French elections is last-minute endorsements or defections. So we've seen a lot of defections in Sarkozy's camp. So François Bayrou, for instance, says he won't endorse any of the candidates, but it'll be interesting to see whether he changes his mind and what the other candidates choose to go for.
That was Zoé Tabary, a journalist at Le Petit Journal, calling for France's presidential candidates to start addressing the real issues facing France. I was also joined by Adrian Pabst from the University of Kent, Jean-Michel Duffrène, a presenter for French Radio London, and over the line from Paris by John Laughland from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. We're always interested in finding out what our listeners think about the show and ideas they may have for future discussions. Why not send us an email to uk@ruvr.ru. Stay tuned for the latest bulletin of world news.